I'd like to begin with a quote from Pope John Paul II, Internet, a New Forum for Proclaiming the Gospel, from paragraph 4 from his World Communication Day of 2002. He says, "The Internet radically redefines a person's psychological relationship to time and space. Attention is riveted on what is tangible, useful, instantly available. The stimulus for deeper thought and reflection may be lacking. Moreover, as a forum in which practically everything is acceptable and almost nothing is lasting, the Internet favors a relativistic way of thinking and sometimes feeds the flight from personal responsibility and commitment. Yet human beings have a vital need for time and inner quiet to ponder and examine life and its mysteries. Understanding and wisdom are the fruit of a contemplative eye upon the world, and do not come from the mere accumulation of facts, no matter how interesting. They are the result of an insight which penetrates the deeper meaning of things in relation to one another and to the whole of reality." Isn't that beautiful? As religious, we are called to put on the mind of Christ. We are in the world, but we're not of the world. We strive to capture every thought for Christ. We must safeguard this, our time with our Lord and with community. Technology is an incredibly useful means to spread the gospel. The question is, how to use it so that it does not evolve into a sort of preoccupation or compulsion, and even today into an addiction. This is the first time that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, which is considered the Bible for mental health care providers, that has the criteria for different disorders, is considering inserting internet addiction, because persons are becoming so compulsively attached to it, to the exclusion of what's really going on in their life. Now, this is significant for the secular world. I might add, though, they're not willing to put in internet pornography, which is much more highly addictive. So you have to wonder about how this massive money-making industry is affecting and lobbying from keeping this as a mental disorder, which it clearly is far more so than just plain internet use. That's a bit of an aside, but I think it's germane to what we are encountering with schools, school children, the number of teachers in healthcare. Everywhere I turn, I hear of individuals encountering children, parents, co-workers who are suffering with some of these things, especially the internet pornography. On more common things for us as religious, though I look at the Vatican website, for example, or ZNet, or look at the news on the internet, oh, that's very good. However, if I spend 3 hours on the Vatican website, it may not be so good. Again, as religious, is that truly within the realm of my vow of poverty? Time is not our own. And can I really justify 3 hours surfing some very wonderful things that are inspiring maybe and uplifting? But have I reached a level of it no longer being inspiring? Because we can't be inspired for 3 hours necessarily, surfing from one thing to another. We fatigue. So it's a point of reflection that I think is germane to this whole notion of boundaries and media. I wouldn't be doing anything wrong, moving from link to link. I wouldn't be reading anything immoral or evil. But I have to ask myself, will such exposure to information on the Vatican website, for example, lead me to a deeper prayer life? Or will it lead me unwittingly to be greedy for information? Can we say that spiritual gluttony can lead to spiritual indigestion? There is an imbalance even with things that are good. We need to be wary that immoderate web surfing does not replace the time that we spend in prayer and relating to those that are actually before us. We need to remain accountable in our responsibilities. Consider this example. A sister was concerned that she prays for the needs of the world. She'd be on the computer in the early morning checking for current news. Whenever there was a question of what the current news report was, Sister was able to give a detailed update. She would often have her email open during the day to avoid missing any new messages. Some messages were work-related, and some others were not. The effect? She was late with her ordinary work, or if she did get it in on time, it would be, quote, under the gun, that she would just get it done. When the issue was addressed by her superiors, she could not see how this was affecting her work. Whenever a project was given, she would first want to research it online. This can be helpful, but even when making a simple feast day card for a sister, it had to be special downloaded pictures with an exorbitant amount of time to create this captivating quote from some spiritual writer, such that it took hours to create this card. It was for good. It was supposed to somehow show this sister a regard for her and her feast day. But is it a little bit out of bounds with regards to the amount of time spent? Unwittingly, I think it's a point of reflection. In this scenario, this sister described herself as a perfectionist. She wanted to do things very well. Staying current with the news, she said, maybe gave her a sense of security. But is that truly a way to gain self-worth? What does it do with regards to self-governance? And again, if we go back to the vows, time is not our own, and yet how do we use time well? And how does this media make us sometimes use time for longer periods than what we had initially intended? I think that's something to consider. Going back also to the vow of obedience. Do I have permission to spend 3 hours making a card, even though I was asked to make a card? Is there a little bit of out of balance there? And we can even think of our vow of chastity. It's not something immoral, but if I think of what I let myself get exposed to visually, am I taking in a little too much, looking for the right image, looking for the right quote, looking for the right decor of the card that I might try to be putting into, such that it's a little bit over the top, that if I didn't have this media available, I wouldn't have spent this amount of time trying to get this card together. Consider also the boundaries between work and leisure. There can evolve an inappropriate familiarity with strangers or acquaintances that can erode the boundaries between work and recreation. What emerges is the erosion of professional decorum. I can have messages from my superior, from my school principal, the teachers, staff, and friends all stack up in my inbox, if I have an email that is more all-inclusive, and I can move from one email to another, either at the convent or in my apostolic work. And what ends up happening is the boundaries between work and leisure break down, such that the distinction between stress and relaxation begin to become less distinct, sometimes to the detriment of relaxation. In my last session, I spoke of procrastination, sometimes going online as a little break. But have you ever spent a couple of hours just surfing something just to get distracted, literally, but not necessarily feel refreshed after that? So it's not truly recreational. And I think persons who are doing work and then going to the internet to answer emails from friends or family that would seem to be more pleasurable or recreational do not necessarily have that effect. So that's an erosion of a boundary that is happening between stress and relaxation. Corporate executives are learning quickly that they are losing valuable employee time when their employees are accessing internet for personal reasons or pleasurable reasons or attached reasons that they say have to do with their work that may not necessarily be the case. There's a recent study that was done, and 50% of the reprimands of employers had to do with employees accessing the internet for personal reasons. 50%. So it's not a small matter that they're having difficulty getting a handle on, even though at work they may have a specific email that is just designated for work. It's so easy then to bring up your own personal email and do something online, and the rest may think you're working hard, and actually you're answering a friend or a family member. It's very hard to have external parameters help with accountability. Much more now is being placed upon the individual to internally have that boundary for accountability. So I think that's another boundary where we need to become more responsible ourselves. But when you think of the fact that there's maybe a regression in the human development, what happens to that responsibility of an internal boundary to say, this is not appropriate for me to be doing here and now? How do we form children? How do we form families? How do we form ourselves as religious regarding the internal boundaries? External boundaries are difficult enough sometimes to put in place with this media. What about my own sense of accountability to what I know is proper for me to be doing with my time, with what I bring into my vision, into my ears? All picking up on the vows. Consider boundaries between religious and biological families. Religious can become over-involved with family while living in their convent through the use of electronic media. And Sister Mary Prudence spoke a little bit about that yesterday. And this can contribute to the breakdown of the convent enclosure. Sisters can be expected to more answer to family tensions or sufferings. And the family member can get angry because then she's not actually there to help. Yeah, it's fine. You can email me a little thought, but you're not here to handle this. You know, why can't you come to so-and-so's wedding? You know, why can't you? And it gives a tug on the sister. It can weigh on her, and at the same time, it can pull her back into old family dynamics that she had left, that she was gaining some ground in becoming free from through her formation as a religious. And now there's a little regressive familial pattern of the dynamics that go on with mom and dad and brother and sister and whoever else is involved in that little melting pot of that familial salvation history. Another example, there was a sister who was in temporary vows who was permitted to use the internet, and she became anxious if she did not email her family to let her parents know what happened during the day at the convent and the apostolate. She felt compelled to email her family every evening for fear that they would worry about her or become angry if they didn't hear from her. She was not saying anything inappropriate, but this communication inflicted a kind of control over her and was detrimental to her vocation. Email and internet can become distracting at the very least and can erode a sister's prayer and community participation. There was another sister who was having surrogate family visits with Skype. Before she entered the community, she was at the university, and so because her mom wanted to visit her and she was going to school in Rome, they got Skype, which is free, and they got a little webcam, so they could actually video her, so she would be before this little video on Skype, and her family had themselves before the video on Skype, so they can see one another. So that was a way to visit while she was away in Rome at school. And this was great. But now she was communicating with her family in the convent, which also had Skype, which is, quote, free, and they had a little video cam, which allowed the community sometimes to have somebody in Australia, for example, be part of a community celebration, or we had one of our sisters in Australia be part of a play that we had for our vicar general by having them be on the screen, and they could see us and we could see them. This was being extended now to her surrogate family visits. And she was a little afraid of getting caught, and yet this computer was in this little office where we usually had these group discussions. But that was a tug on her. So these surrogate visits that were evolving with Skype and some of the technology that made it available. Can this cause havoc to a sense of inner peace? Can it contribute to a distraction in prayer? Can it affect these sisters' participation, actually being present too with a sense of belonging in the common life? Sister spoke of the common good yesterday. Though the other sisters might not be aware that this is going on, is it affecting her individual good, which the others might feel or experience from her because of that little sense of withdrawal? More affectively connected to her family, is it having her be less developing that healthy, necessary affective connection with community, which partakes of that spirituality of communion, which we long for, which is a very deep and intimate one that takes our whole being at that deep spousal level of where we're called. That loving according to my vocation and loving my vocation. It can erode that boundary, which is more an interior one, which I think is more subtle, but because it is more subtle and interior, is more detrimental. In closing, I'd like to read from a quote from the CMSWR book, The Foundations of Religious Life. And it's the chapter that was written by Mother Agnes and Sister Elizabeth, who are Sisters of Life, which I thought was very beautiful. And she said, touched by God's love, called into a deep personal relationship with Him alone, as the source, center, and goal of one's life, the person who hands her life completely over to the Lord to be set apart for Him alone, give up worldly riches, the possibility of exclusive affection with another human being, and makes the supreme sacrifice of his or her own will. What is left is the person, stripped of any status gained from family background, education, worldly achievements, or possessions acquired. Admittedly, the enunciation of many natural human goods can be the source of personal suffering, but a suffering offered for the world in union with Christ, and a sacrifice that does not overwhelm hope. This very renunciation of temporal goods, made in freedom for the sake of the eternal, gives moral authority to the witness of hope offered by religious to the world. If religious life is engaged fully and authentically, the joy and freedom found in the midst of obvious renunciations is itself a powerful witness to the world. How is such joy and freedom possible? It is precisely through this letting go and in the purification of heart that follows that the deepest yearnings of the human heart are awakened. Infinite love, enduring beyond death, mercy that heals all wounds, and certain hope in eternal life.